For thousands of years, the myths of ancient Egypt shaped the hearts, hopes, and fears of an entire civilization. These were not just stories, they were the very foundation of how the world worked, how people lived, and how they died. Tonight, we journey into a world of gods and monsters, of sacred rivers and eternal deserts, of birth, betrayal, and rebirth. This is the entire story of Egyptian mythology. Long before the first stone of the pyramids was laid, before the Nile carved its path through golden sand, before names like Osiris or Isis echoed across temple walls, there was only one thing: none, the vast, formless, eternal ocean of darkness. There was no sky, no sun, no land, no time, just infinite, silent water, an endless void, heavy and still. But from this endless chaos came a single spark, a ripple on the surface of nothingness, a moment of will. And from that moment emerged a mound, the Benben, the first land to rise from the waters, a small sacred hill upon which the first god appeared. His name was Atum. Unlike the gods who would follow, Atum had no parents, no creator. He existed purely by force of will. He was the beginning and the end, the creator of all that was and all that would ever be. Standing upon the mound, Atum surveyed the dark waters of Nun and began the work of shaping the world. But he was alone. To remedy this, Atum gave birth to 2 children. How exactly he did this was the subject of different beliefs. Some said he sneezed them out. Others said he spat them into being, or brought them forth through his own essence. Regardless of the method, his children were Shu, the god of air and breath, the space between all things; Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, dew and balance. Together, Shu and Tefnut embodied the essential elements of life: air and water, breath and flow, lightness and cohesion. But one day, the 2 vanished. Atum was heartbroken. He sent his eye, a divine force or part of his own being, to search for them in the watery chaos. When they were finally found and returned, Atum wept with joy. And where his tears touched the earth, the first humans were born. Shu and Tefnut, now reunited, gave birth to 2 more gods: Geb, the god of earth, who lay flat and steady; Nut, the goddess of the sky, who arched protectively above. Nut and Geb were deeply in love, so inseparable in fact that they clung together in a passionate embrace, forming a union of earth and sky. But their closeness threatened to stifle creation. There was no room for light, for movement, for life to blossom. So Atum, sometimes with the help of Shu, forced them apart. Shu lifted Nut high above, becoming the air that separated sky from earth. Geb remained below, becoming the soil, the rocks, the foundation of the world. To the Egyptians, this wasn't metaphor. It was literal. Each morning, Nut gave birth to the sun. She swallowed it each evening, carrying it through her body until it rose again. The stars were her children, twinkling across her body in the night sky. Beneath her, Geb provided everything humans needed to live: plants, crops, animals, and the ground they walked on. Now that the world had air, sky, land, and water, creation could truly begin. And so the next generation of gods was born: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, 4 siblings who would bring order, love, betrayal, death, and resurrection into the world. But before we meet them, we must understand. To the ancient Egyptians, this myth was not fiction. It was reality woven into metaphor. When they looked up at the stars, they saw Nut. When they stood barefoot on the warm soil, they stood upon Geb. When the wind blew, it was Shu passing between them. And when they cried, they remembered Atum's tears, the tears that gave birth to mankind. Egyptian mythology didn't separate gods from nature. The gods were nature. They were the forces of existence given names and stories so people could understand their world. This is how everything began. From the dark silence of Nun to the first breath of Shu and the first drop of Tefnut's dew. From the embrace of Nut and Geb and the sorrowful joy of Atom's lonely creation. And it was only the beginning. Because the world, now formed, was about to be tested. A sacred order had been set in place, and it would soon be broken. As the world settled into form, and the elements of air, earth, water, and sky took their places, the divine family expanded. From the union of Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess, 4 powerful deities were born. They were Osiris, wise, just, and beloved. He would become the king of all Egypt and the god of fertility and renewal. Isis, Osiris's sister and wife, the goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing. Set, their brother, lord of chaos, storms, and the scorching desert. Nephthys, sister of Isis, a quieter goddess linked to morning, night, and protection. These 4 gods would define the fate of all life on Earth and in the underworld. Osiris, eldest among them, became the king of Egypt, not just of the gods, but of the living people as well. He was a kind and visionary ruler, said to have taught humans the secrets of farming, animal husbandry, architecture, and religious worship. Under his rule, the land flourished. Crops grew tall, the Nile flowed calmly, and the people thrived. Isis stood by his side, not as a queen who lingered in the background, but as an equal. She used her magical powers to protect the kingdom, cure diseases, and guide souls. The world was in harmony for a while, but not everyone rejoiced. In the shadows, Set, Osiris's younger brother, brooded with resentment. Set ruled over the dry, wild deserts, where storms raged and the earth cracked. His realm was the antithesis of Osiris's fertile lands. While Osiris brought life, Set lived in chaos, and chaos hates order. Worse still, the people adored Osiris. They sang his name in prayers. They built statues in his honor. They gave offerings, not to Set, but to the just and noble king. Set felt invisible, powerless, unloved. And so, he began to plot. Set's plan was as brilliant as it was cruel. He commissioned a beautiful coffin, exquisitely crafted, made of the finest cedar, inlaid with gold and precious stones. But it was no ordinary coffin. It was made to fit Osiris's exact body. Then, at a grand banquet attended by gods and mortals alike, Set brought forth the coffin as a gift. With feigned generosity, he announced, "Whosoever fits perfectly inside this chest shall receive it as a gift." One by one, the guests tried. Some were too tall, some too short. All failed. Then Osiris stepped forward. He lay inside. Of course, it fit him perfectly. In that instant, Set and his followers slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and locked it tight. Before anyone could stop him, Set cast the coffin into the Nile. The river carried it away, Osiris trapped inside, alive. The banquet erupted into panic, but it was too late. Osiris, king of Egypt, was gone. Isis's grief was immeasurable. Her husband, her brother, her king, stolen in an instant. But she did not collapse in despair. She searched. Disguised as a mortal woman, she wandered Egypt and beyond, asking animals, children, and even the winds for answers. Finally, she found the coffin. It had washed ashore in Byblos, a faraway land. There it had become embedded in the trunk of a great tamarisk tree. The locals, unaware of what lay inside, had used the tree's wood as a pillar in their king's palace. Isis, ever clever, found a way into the palace. She revealed her true identity and retrieved the coffin. At last, she had Osiris back. But her joy was short-lived. Set, learning of her success, was filled with fury. This time, he wouldn't risk another chance. He found the body of Osiris, tore open the coffin, and hacked the corpse into 14 pieces. Then, in a fit of rage, he scattered the body parts across the land of Egypt, from the delta to the desert. Each piece was thrown to a different corner, so no one could ever restore Osiris again. Set had not just murdered his brother, he had desecrated him, defiled him, made him disappear into the earth itself. But Isis was not done. With unmatched devotion, Isis began her second journey. She sailed the Nile in a papyrus boat. She followed whispers of jackals, signs in the stars, clues in dreams. With the help of her sister Nephthys, the two women recovered every part of Osiris, except for one. His phallus, which had been swallowed by a fish, was lost forever. But even incomplete, Isis would not give up. With the guidance of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and funerary rites, the sisters anointed the body with sacred oils. They wrapped it in linen bandages. They performed the first mummification. Then, Isis used her most powerful magic, older than time itself, to breathe life into Osiris. For one brief, miraculous moment, he lived again. From this union, Isis conceived a child, a son who would grow up to challenge Set himself. His name was Horus. Osiris, though briefly alive, could not stay in the land of the living. His body was too damaged. His time had passed. Instead, he descended into Duat, the Egyptian underworld. But he did not fall into darkness. He rose as its king. Osiris became the lord of the dead, the judge of souls, the silent presence that awaited every person after death. The land of the dead was not a place of punishment, but of judgment and rebirth. And Osiris, who had suffered, died, and risen again, was the perfect ruler of that realm. He was no longer king of Egypt, but king of eternity. This myth of Osiris's murder, Isis's devotion, Set's betrayal, and the birth of Horus was more than a tale. It was the foundation of Egyptian religion. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth echoed through every funeral, every tomb painting, every prayer offered by the living to their ancestors. It explained why the Nile flooded, why crops died and returned, why kings must die to make way for new ones. And in the hearts of Egyptians, Isis became the symbol of motherly love and sacred magic. Osiris became the ultimate hope that even after death, something greater awaits. And Set, though feared, was necessary. Chaos must exist so that order can triumph over it. But the story did not end there, because somewhere, growing in secret, was Horus, a child of prophecy, destined to avenge his father and restore balance to the world. And so began the greatest divine rivalry of them all. Horus was born in secret, hidden away in the marshes of the Nile Delta. Isis, fearing that Set would discover and destroy him as he had done to Osiris, raised her son in silence and shadow. She taught him everything she knew, magic, wisdom, and the truth about what had been done to his father. As Horus grew, so too did his strength and resolve. He knew his life had one purpose, to challenge Set and reclaim the throne of Egypt. When he was old enough, he emerged from hiding and stepped forward to make his claim before the Council of the Gods. Set, unsurprisingly, refused to relinquish the throne. He declared Horus too young, too unproven, and accused Isis of manipulating events through sorcery. The gods were divided. Some, like Thoth and Hathor, supported Horus. Others, swayed by Set's power and intimidation, hesitated. the gods decided a series of trials would determine the rightful king. What followed was not a single battle, but a long and exhausting war, one that stretched for years, filled with duels, trickery, and divine contests that often bordered on the absurd. In one version, Horus and Set turned into hippos and fought each other in the Nile, splashing and thrashing like wild beasts. In another, Set challenged Horus to a boat race, using vessels made entirely of stone. Horus, ever clever, secretly built his from wood, but disguised it to look like stone. Set's boat sank instantly. Horus glided across the water. But the conflict wasn't just about strength. There were courtroom debates among the gods, passionate arguments, and dramatic betrayals. Isis herself intervened more than once, pleading with the gods to honor justice and restore the legacy of Osiris. At one point, Isis captured Set in a magical net and presented him before the gods. But Horus, angry that his mother had interfered instead of letting him win on his own, lashed out, cutting off her head in a moment of rage. The gods were horrified. Thoth, the god of wisdom, restored Isis using magic, but the rift between mother and son lingered. Set, too, fought with cunning and cruelty. In one tale, he gouged out Horus's eye during battle and buried it in the sand. The wound was severe, but Thoth healed Horus, and the eye, once restored, became a symbol of healing and protection for all Egyptians, the famous Eye of Horus. Eventually, after countless years of struggle, the gods convened for a final judgment. The council listened again to all sides, weighed the deeds, the trials, the sacrifices, and finally they chose Horus. He was declared the rightful king of Egypt, the heir of Osiris, and the new divine ruler of the living world. Set, though defeated, was not destroyed. Instead, he was cast out, banished to the desert, a god of storms and chaos who would forever remain at the edges of order, a reminder of what happens when power turns to jealousy. Horus ascended the throne, not just as a god, but as the symbol of every future pharaoh. From that moment on, every king of Egypt was seen as a living embodiment of Horus, continuing his legacy, maintaining the divine balance between chaos and order. Though the war had ended, its echoes never faded. The struggle between Horus and Set was etched into temple walls, whispered in sacred hymns, and remembered in every coronation for centuries to come. The kingdom of the gods had found peace again, but only for now. Not all gods ruled over grand wars, kings, or the afterlife. Many lived in the quiet places, the home, the fields, the classroom, the night sky. To the ancient Egyptians, the divine wasn't distant. It was present, woven into every corner of their daily lives. When a scribe picked up his reed pen, he whispered a prayer to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and time. Thoth was believed to have invented language itself, and his words were sacred. Every temple inscription, every legal decree, every love letter was written under his watchful eye. He carried the moon on his head, recording the passage of nights and days, marking time with precision. If a family welcomed a child, they thanked Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, beauty, and music. Often depicted with the ears of a cow or the horns cradling the sun disk, she brought joy, fertility, and celebration. Hathor danced at births, comforted the dying, and welcomed souls into the afterlife with her songs. In the kitchens and marketplaces, where people cooked, traded, and tended their homes, the gentle gaze of Bastet kept them safe. She was the cat goddess, fierce yet protective. Egyptians loved cats not just for their pest control, but because they carried Bastet's spirit. To harm a cat was to anger the goddess herself. Bastet was believed to ward off evil spirits, plagues, and misfortune. Her presence was felt in every flick of a tail or purr in the corner of a home. In the shadows and thresholds, where danger lurked, there was Bes, a strange, dwarf-like god with a lion's mane, wide eyes, and a perpetual grin. He looked odd, almost humorous, but he was beloved. Bes protected mothers during childbirth, guarded sleeping children, and frightened off nightmares. Images of Bes were carved into bed frames, painted on walls, and worn as amulets. No one feared Bes. He was the fear of fear itself. Then there was Ma'at, perhaps the most important goddess of all, yet invisible. She wasn't prayed to in hopes of miracles. She didn't demand grand temples or dramatic rituals. She was balance itself. Ma'at governed truth, justice, and the natural order. She was the force that kept the stars in place, the Nile flowing, the seasons turning. When people acted with honesty and fairness, they were said to be living in Ma'at. Even the gods bowed to her authority. Every court case, every royal decision, every weighing of the heart in the afterlife was judged by her standards. Her symbol was a simple ostrich feather, but that feather would decide the fate of your soul. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the dead. Where Osiris ruled the underworld, Anubis walked its roads. He wrapped the dead, protected their bodies, and guided them through the first stages of the afterlife. Egyptians feared death, but not Anubis. He was not a god of punishment. He was a god of process, making sure the journey was safe, respectful, and complete. When a body was prepared for burial, it was Anubis who was invoked to ensure the organs were properly removed and placed into canopic jars. It was his face the priests wore as a mask during rituals, and it was Anubis who would lead the soul to its final judgment. Even the great sun god Ra, ruler of all life, was not some distant figure in the sky. He was the daily heartbeat of time itself. Every morning, Ra sailed across the heavens in his golden boat, bringing sunlight and warmth. Every night, he descended into the underworld, battling chaos to ensure that the dawn would return. People greeted the sunrise, not just as a natural event, but as the rebirth of Ra, proof that order had triumphed over darkness once again. Egyptian life was saturated with the divine. There was a god for beer, a goddess for scorpions, a deity for measuring grain. There were household gods that lived in closets and kitchen corners. Children wore protective charms shaped like frogs, crocodiles, and cobras, each representing a different spirit watching over them. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were energy centers where the divine and mortal realms touched. Priests bathed statues, offered food to them, and carried them in processions through the streets. But even in homes without statues, the gods were there, in amulets, in carved scarabs, in whispered prayers over breakfast. To modern minds, it may seem excessive. Hundreds of gods, rituals, and spells for everything from planting seeds to swatting flies. But to the Egyptians, this was how the world worked. They didn't believe in one story, one answer, or one path. Their mythology was a vast, shifting landscape where gods could merge, change forms, or contradict themselves. And that was fine, because life was the same, messy, layered, unpredictable. In this way, Egyptian mythology wasn't just a religion, it was a language, one that helped people make sense of birth, love, conflict, and loss. A way to understand why the river rose, why the sun set, why people die, and why dreams feel real. And in this language, the gods of daily life whispered constantly. They were not far away. They were everywhere. To the ancient Egyptians, death was never the end. It was a doorway, one that opened not into silence, but into a world just as vivid and structured as the one left behind. This belief shaped everything: how they lived, how they prayed, how they built their tombs, how they spoke of time. In life, one prepared for death, and in death, one hoped to live again. The journey after death was long. It was difficult. and it was not guaranteed. When a person died, their body was carefully preserved through the sacred process of mummification. This was not merely a practical step, it was spiritual. The body was seen as the house of the soul. If it decayed, the soul might become lost, unable to recognize itself in the afterlife. Priests removed the organs, dried the body with natron salt, wrapped it in linen, and anointed it with oils. Spells were recited. Charms and amulets were placed between layers of wrappings. Each step was a safeguard, a blessing, a promise. Once the body was placed in its coffin and the tomb sealed, the soul's journey truly began. The Egyptians believed the soul was made of several parts. The ka, a person's vital essence. The ba, their personality, their memories, their energy. And the ak, a radiant form, the transformed spirit that could enter the eternal realms. The ka remained near the body, needing offerings of food and drink to stay nourished. The ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, was free to move between worlds, visiting the living, watching over loved ones, or drifting through dreams. But both Ka and Ba needed to be reunited to form the Ak, and this could only happen after the soul completed its journey through Duat, the underworld. Duat was not a place of fire and punishment. It was more like a cosmic map, a vast, shifting realm filled with dangers, wonders, and gates. The soul would pass through 12 regions, each representing an hour of the night. The path was perilous. Serpents coiled in the darkness. Lakes of fire hissed beneath bridges of stone. Enormous gates blocked the way, guarded by fearsome beings with names as long and strange as the spells needed to pass them. To survive this journey, the soul relied on the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, passwords, and instructions, often written on papyrus scrolls and buried with the deceased. These texts weren't meant to scare. They were like travel guides for eternity. Sometimes the dead would sail on a boat, just as Ra did each night, battling the great serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. Other times, the soul would walk on foot, guided by Anubis, who watched over them with calm, jackal eyes. Eventually, the soul reached its most important destination, the Hall of Two Truths. Here stood Osiris, now the king of the underworld. Seated on his throne, flanked by 42 judges, he waited to determine the fate of every soul that entered. But first, the soul underwent the weighing of the heart. Thoth, god of wisdom and scribe of the gods, stood nearby with his pen and scroll. Anubis brought forth a great scale. On one side, he placed the person's heart, the seat of thought and morality. On the other, he placed the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and balance. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul had lived a life of harmony, honesty, and balance. They were allowed to enter the field of reeds, a paradise that mirrored the best parts of Egypt: green fields, calm waters, abundant harvests, and peace without end. But if the heart was heavy with lies, cruelty, or imbalance, it sank. Waiting beside the scale was a terrible creature, Amit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. Amit devoured the impure heart in one bite. The soul was erased, cast into oblivion. There was no eternal torment, just non-existence. To the Egyptians, that was the greatest fear of all, to be forgotten. Those who passed the judgment found themselves reborn. In the field of reeds, they were reunited with loved ones, lived in beauty, and enjoyed everything they loved in life, without pain, without aging, without end. But they were not locked in place. The Ak could still return to the world of the living. It could send messages through dreams, watch over family, appear as birds or breezes or sudden shivers in the night. The veil between life and death was not sealed. It was thin, and souls passed through it gently, respectfully. This belief made death less frightening for the Egyptians. Funerals were not only mournful, they were hopeful. Every tomb was a home, every sarcophagus a vessel for eternity. The living wrote letters to the dead. They brought them food. They spoke their names aloud, for to be remembered was to remain alive. And the gods played their part in every step. Isis, protector of the dead. Nephthys, guardian of the tomb. Thoth, recorder of truth. Ma'at, keeper of balance. Osiris, judge and king. Anubis, gentle guide. Together they ensured that no one travelled alone. In the end, the journey through the afterlife was not about fear, but about transformation. The Egyptians believed that every soul, if properly prepared and true of heart, could rise again, renewed, eternal, and embraced by the gods. To them, death was simply a longer road, one that led home. Time passed, the winds shifted, the Nile rose and fell, and kingdoms crumbled like sand. The temples of Egypt, once alive with chanting priests and golden offerings, fell quiet. Statues were buried, scrolls forgotten, and the names of gods faded into the dust. But the stories remained. Whispers of Osiris, the dying king who rose again, of Isis, the devoted magician, of Horus, the falcon with fire in his heart, of Set, wild and unpredictable, of Ra, the ever-rising sun. They were carved into walls, painted in tombs, spoken in shadows. Egyptian mythology was never a fixed thing. It was fluid, like the river itself, changing, dividing, rejoining. Gods merged, took on new forms, faded, and returned. Over thousands of years, dynasties rose and reinterpreted the old tales. Some gods who were once mighty became minor. Others who were obscure became central. But they were never truly gone, because mythology was never just about gods. It was about people trying to understand the world around them, why the sun rises, why we dream, why we love, why we die. The myths offered explanations, comfort, meaning. They gave a face to the wind, a name to the stars, a purpose to sorrow. They turned the chaos of nature into a story, and in doing so, helped people live. In the villages, families still told the old tales. Farmers still looked to the Nile and remembered Hapi, the god of its floods. Children wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, not knowing its full story, but trusting it would keep them safe. And even now, centuries later, the echoes continue. Modern scholars piece together fragments of papyrus. Tourists stand in the shadow of crumbling obelisks, gazing up at silent gods who once held the sky. Artists, writers, filmmakers, all draw from the well of Egyptian myth. It still fascinates, still inspires. Perhaps because at its heart, Egyptian mythology was never just about power, or fear, or grandeur. It was about balance, about living in harmony with the world, with each other, and with the divine. About remembering the dead, honoring the past, and preparing for what comes next. About finding eternity not in escape, but in connection. The gods may be quiet now, the priests long gone, but the stories, they live on, etched in stone, echoing through time, and maybe tonight, echoing softly in your dreams.